Hey, everybody, welcome back. I'm Emily Moyer, and this is Strange Mosaic, and this is the first recording of this show of 2023. Happy New Year to everybody. Before we get started, I received some really nice gifts from people out there who I work with or who I've come in contact with through doing shows with them and whatnot. I want to thank Paraplegic and Grounded Extracts and my good friend Kathy for the really lovely gift packages that I received over the holidays. Thank you so much. I appreciate your friendship and support. And we're kicking the new year off today with a great guest. He was not long ago what seemed to be the perfect product of the establishment system, a graduate from an Ivy League university and very successful in the financial and tech fields, but a chance encounter with some information about near-death experiences started him on a path that would transform him from physicalist to non-dualist and from statist to voluntarist. He is a public speaker, now the author of 5 books, and dearest to my heart, the former captain of the Princeton tennis team. Mark Gober, welcome to Strange Mosaic. How are you doing?
I'm well, Emily. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. I am probably the worst tennis player in the world, but an avid, really avid watcher, fan, and commentator of tennis from all kinds of perspectives. And so when I first heard about you and sentence 2 or 3 of what you said about yourself was that you were a Division I tennis player, I was like, oh, this is going to be great. I can talk to him about all this, important stuff I really care about. And then the less important, but also fun stuff I care about too. So anywho, so yeah, I heard you, I'd never heard of you until I was getting ready to be a guest on The Melt. And whenever I'm going on someone's show, I like to go sort of hear what their thing is. And you had been, I think, the most recent guest at that point on. And so I went and listened and was blown away by their interview style, but also very taken with you and how impressive your grasp on a really large, broad field of information and then the specifics within it was, and how quickly you had come to it, because you don't often meet too many people like that. There were some things about my sort of awakening that were similar. And as I started to listen to you, I started to recognize maybe what some of those were and why. So I'm excited to explore some of that with you today as well. But first, let people know who you are, how you got to where you are, what has happened for you over the course of the last 5 years or so, which have been in some ways transformative for everybody, but specifically very transformative for you. And I would like to get to know you a bit.
Sure. Well, I want to preface this by saying that my journey has been very much unexpected. I didn't plan to become interested in the nature of reality, politics, all the things I'm now writing about. It wasn't part of my plan. After I graduated from college, I went into investment banking in New York, and I was there during the financial crisis. So from 2008 to 2010, and I was feeling really lost because I knew I didn't want to do investment banking long term, but I didn't feel like I had any meaning or purpose driving my life. I thought we just lived in a random and meaningless universe, and I just had to try to survive and try to achieve the next thing, because I was very focused on accomplishments at that point in my life. Like I would achieve something, and then almost like being on a treadmill, I'd be looking for the next thing. And that starts to get old after a while when you realize you're on a treadmill. So I started to have a sense of that when I was working in New York, but then I joined a firm where I spent 10 years, first start in Boston and then in Silicon Valley, which is where I spent most of my time. And that was advising companies in the technology field on their innovations. So helping them with transactions. So if they wanted to buy another company's assets, we'd help them with that. If they wanted to sell their assets to another party, we'd help broker that. We'd help with strategy. So again, that was my world. It was a little bit more interesting because I was focused on technology and the things that were being innovated and patents in particular. So that was more intellectually stimulating, but it didn't answer the bigger questions that lingered for me. So I basically hit a wall. Maybe I could see the first signs of it, 2014, 2015, where I had this deep sense of meaninglessness, not sure what I wanted to do personally, professionally, even though I was on a great track. If you're looking at it from the outside, I mean, I was in a great position. I had great colleagues, learning about interesting stuff, but there was something missing. And the key point here is that I was not explicitly looking for something different. because I thought I already knew what the nature of reality was, which is it's all random and meaningless. And in 2016, I started to listen to podcasts because they were becoming more popular. Started off at a friend's suggestion. I was listening to Tim Ferriss and venture capitalists on Tim Ferriss' show. And I said, wow, this is so cool. You can hear about someone's whole life story, and it's just on Apple Podcasts right on my phone. So I started to listen to Tim Ferriss, which was a little bit alternative. He got into some interesting stuff with psychedelics, which was not my path, but he talked about like sensory deprivation that you could do to try to open up your mind. So then I did sensory deprivation tanks where you're floating in salt water, and there's so much salt that your body stays afloat and you're just laying on your back and your mind goes to different places. So I was kind of interested in alternative stuff, started to listen to alternative health shows, including a show called Extreme Health Radio. And that's where I heard my first episode that got into the paranormal stuff. And it was an interview with a woman named Laura Powers. And it was not an interview that I was seeking out. It just happened to be the next one that was up. And she talked about her own communications with non-physical beings, psychic abilities, and all that sort of thing. And she mentioned her own podcast, which is called Healing Powers. I said, okay, that sounds like an interesting one. Why don't I add that to my list of podcasts? And she interviewed lots of other people who had these extraordinary experiences. And it got to the point when I heard enough people describe similar things from different perspectives, I realized like maybe there's something wrong with my worldview. And I was so disoriented after a certain amount of time because I didn't know how to reconcile all this new evidence with what I thought to be true. And if any of this other stuff were true, then that would mean I'd have to rethink all of life. And that would mean that everyone around me, my network, that means, could it be that they're so off base? Could we be living in a world that is completely off base? That was the kind of thing I was thinking about. And as I was trying to reconcile this data, I was learning more and more. And long story short, that has propelled me to now write 5 books and do a podcast series. The first book came out in 2018, but I wrote it a year later in 2017. It's called An End to Upside Down Thinking. And it's about the evidence that the brain does not produce consciousness, meaning like the paranormal, so to speak, is actually not paranormal. It's totally within the realm of possibility, and there's a lot of evidence for it. And then I produced a podcast series with Blue Duck Media the next year where I interviewed many of the scientists that I was writing about. And that took me to the end of 2019. The podcast is called Where Is My Mind? It's an 8-episode series. So at the end of 2019, I was sitting there, I had the first book done, podcast series done, still felt like there was a lot I needed to learn and explore. And at the time I was still working as a partner at my firm. So I was really splitting my energy where I was working on high stakes client material where you can't make any mistakes in that field. Clients are, they need your attention. So I had to really switch on the business part of my life for part of my time. But then I was interested in this other stuff, which was using a different part of my brain, it felt like. And it became taxing to split my energy like that. So I made a decision to leave my firm, not knowing what would be next. And I made the decision to basically transition out in early 2020. So I wouldn't just leave cold turkey, that I would help people transition clients and things like that. But at the time, I didn't know COVID was going to happen. So it was really interesting timing. And since then, I've written 4 more books, still not really sure what's next. The most recent one just came out called An End to the Upside Down Reset, which is about the World Economic Forum's Great Reset. But all the books are getting at a similar idea, which is I'm trying to understand who we are, what we're doing here, and what is this world that we're in.
So, well, thank you for that. I think that was like a good condensed sort of description of what went on there. I want to ask you a little bit about your childhood, and what, how this foundation of being incredibly intelligent and achievements focused, like oriented towards accomplishment, and also simultaneously this idea that life is meaningless and random. It sounds very familiar to me, right? And so I'm curious about sort of, what the nature of your family dynamic was, and like, what were some of is the drive for achievement yours, or did it come from your family? Like, what were the values that you sort of grew up with?
I think I've always been self-motivated. I've been surrounded by a lot of people who are successful, but I never felt explicit pressure. If anything, people in my family and friends were telling me to calm down and that it was okay not to always try to succeed. But I was surrounded by a lot of success and high achievement. So there was probably some osmosis there. And in terms of a spiritual religious worldview, I grew up in a Jewish household, but not a religious one. So that was never a big part of my life in terms of taking the actual religion seriously. I mean, we would do holidays with family and things like that, but that was more of a cultural thing. And I think my nihilistic worldview that life was random and meaningless, that came more from what I was learning about science. And the more educated I became at the highest levels of education, that's what they're really saying. Sometimes not explicitly, but that's like the undertone. So as I got older, that became more and more ingrained. I don't know if I started off that way. It's hard for me to identify where that flip was, but it was totally my worldview. I don't know if I would have called myself explicitly an atheist, because I even remember myself thinking, well, there's always a possibility there's something that I don't know. But I was atheistic, agnostic, something like that. And that was not imposed on me. I feel like I got there on my own.
Yeah. So what you described is actually almost exactly the scenario that I grew up in, right? My family, I'm the only person in my immediate family without a PhD, really. Well, my mom, she technically didn't achieve the PhD because she went to work before, like she wrote the thesis, but she went to all of the sort of programs, and she was actually the high achiever in the family. But my father's got a PhD and a law degree and master's, and my sister is a professor at a university and has a PhD. So I was surrounded with that as well. As a child, I displayed all of those same sort of tendencies, right? I was very good at school. I was a gymnast. I competed Division I as well.
Wow.
You know, so similar kinds of things, 5 or more hours of practice a day of athletics, private school, homework, but not the level of pressure from my family that you often see with people who are achieving at that level either. It was kind of more, this is just what we do. And, you know, calm down as well. Same thing, as I was pretty high strung. Also from a Jewish family that I would consider more like culturally like Brooklyn Jew, like somewhere between Brooklyn Jew and like lawyer Jew, kind of culturally Jewish, right? Like the arguing and like the being right and all of that kind of stuff was valued, but not the religious traditions. We liked the food. We didn't really celebrate, you know, the holidays in any meaningful ways, but I was around some of that, but no religion. We didn't go to temple or church, and there was never any talk about like God or spirituality in my family. Like any of those broader, more meaningful conversations were generally of like either a political or an activist-y kind of like bent. And then I also, until I had an experience in my 30s that moved me from atheist / agnostic, somewhere maybe vacillating between those two, dependent on my mood, like, right? Dependent on like how, if things were shitty, then like, yeah, there's definitely no God and everything's random. If something went well, then well, maybe there's something out there, but I don't really know, right? That kind of thing. You know, and again, like not a background with it. Was very similar for me, but I too found myself at a certain point, like maybe a little earlier than you, like the college athletics thing didn't work out for me, and college didn't work out for me, and I started to question certain things, maybe not about the fundamental nature of reality in the way that you did, maybe a little bit more conspiratorial of a bent, that like I was being lied to and that bothered me, but like a very similar path and pattern that you describe, right? And when I did sort of come to the information, sort of similar to you, I dove in sort of head first, and had like within, you know, a couple of years, sort of really understood the whole field of like where political corruption, conspiracy, the spirituality, metaphysics, all these different things that sort of get clumped into the alternative information sort of reality come together, and then specifically made the jump from like belief in authority to not believing in authority, like pretty quickly, like within almost months, which it sounds like almost was for you as well. It's funny, one of the Tim Ferriss was not part of my awakening path, but I'm familiar with him and I could see how that could be. But Extreme Health Radio was part of my awakening path. the health portion, which came a little later than some of the other stuff for me. And the person who helped me sort of turn my health around, and then really a significant internal change in myself. I didn't find her on Extreme Health, but once I found her somewhere else, the next interview I went and listened to her on was Extreme Health Radio. So I've been familiar with them and their work for a really long time. And it is interesting how we sort of get some of these little stops in our road that turn out to be much more significant. So what you're saying all sounds familiar. Did you, before you had this sort of awareness that there was things going on outside of the material world, when you were working in banking, in tech, did you ever come across like a moment of like crisis of consciousness based on what appeared to be going on in the world, and then the organizations you were working with, or the concern that some of these technologies might be used for like something other than what the designers were specifically saying they were created for? Had you had that moment before, or did you ever have that moment?
No, I didn't have that moment while I was working. Now I have big concerns, but it wasn't on my mind then. I mean, when I was in banking in New York, I wasn't in the tech space. My clients were in the financial field. So we were advising banks and insurance companies and asset managers. And I was at a company called UBS, which is a large global bank. So I was at a bank advising other financial institutions, and that was my world. I had concerns with that place, with that general space, because of the, I don't know, the culture, I'd say. It was just about do well, make money, succeed. There was nothing else. It was this other world. I don't know how to explain it. And it was all about working nonstop. I mean, I went for months straight without a day off, including weekends, and working until 2, 3, 4 a.m., sometimes later. And that was just part of the culture. So I knew something was off in that realm. I didn't see anything really other than that. I mean, I was an analyst. I was the low person on the totem pole doing the price charts and the pie graphs and things like that, and some of the financial modeling. So I wasn't privy to anything really corrupt there. If I were there now, I'm sure I would look at it differently. But when I was in the tech field, what I did see was corruption in the media, in the court systems, and maybe a little bit in the technology industry, because I dealt with patents. That's it. That can be an adversarial field where people are stealing from each other and then suing each other as a result of that. So you could imagine how there could be companies trying to tip the scales in their favor in that world. That's just part of the competitive environment. So I saw some of those elements that became very familiar when I saw what was happening with COVID in early 2020. It reminded me so much of what I saw professionally in terms of censorship and the media trying to spin things in a certain way, and just corruption that I saw, not within my own company, but within the industry, just because we were involved in so many things. I saw it there. And then I also saw it in the consciousness space when I was looking at research that contradicted the mainstream narrative of science. There's a lot of suppression there. So the dots started to come together in terms of general conspiracy. For me, starting in 2020, that's when I became really interested in that. Before that, between, let's say, 2016 and 2019, I was more focused on the spiritual aspects and science and the nature of reality. And so I started, maybe we had a different path in terms of like where we started. You might have started more of the conspiracy and then gotten to the spiritual part, and I went the other way. But if you're looking for the truth, including health, it's all this stuff is inevitable. No matter where you start, it all starts to come together, I found.
Yeah, I haven't found a single person that I feel is like holistically after the bigger picture idea of like what's going on here, and finding, I don't know if there's such thing as the truth, but finding truth that hasn't spent time in all of those sort of pools, right? And doesn't see how they are braided together in a way that is, you can't just pull out one and say, well, this part is less important, so let's push this to the side, right? And I'm now suspicious when people do that, right? When they're not sort of taking a holistic view of the field, then yeah. So what I want to mostly, like I did I got your Liberty book and your Contact book, and I thought, oh, well, we'll do an hour on Liberty and then we'll do an hour on Contact. But when I got the Liberty book and some other things that have been going on around me, like have made me more focused on that recently, which is something that in my own awakening, I focused on a long time ago, but has not been sort of the center focus of a lot of my work. The sort of voluntarist stuff, even though that is what I am, that part for me came before I was ever creating content or being in the media, right? And now I'm much more focused on things like synchromysticism and metaphysics and whatnot. But I've come to the realization that a lot of people in the listening audience don't know some of the things that I just took for granted from my earlier, years of research and whatnot. So I had decided I was going to do some more things on that this year. And so when I read your book, I'm like, now there's enough here for pretty much a whole show and whatever kind of topics branch off of that. So maybe we'll do Contact, or I know you said you have a new book. Maybe some of that we'll talk about at the end, because that closely relates to the liberty issues more than the Contact issues, although it's all related. So I think we're going to focus on that today. What was for you? Seemed like you were really interested, or it was almost seemed like a fascination with how many ghost stories or how many near-death experiences can I hear after I've discovered that this thing exists. And then the correlation of the experiences from disparate sources was overwhelming for you at a point. What was the path from that to, we have a freedom problem here, right? We have like a freedom problem that involves our relationship with government and institutions and whatnot. Haven't heard you mentioned that like politics was a big thing in your family. I don't think I've ever heard you even say that like you used to be a Democrat or a Republican or anything like that. So how did this become, because I actually think that you do maybe the most sort of agile and nimble and flexible sort of presentation of voluntarism of almost anyone out there. Everybody else seems to be focused on like one part of it more than another part of it, and you kind of grasped the whole thing. How did that shift from like consciousness and NDEs particularly to voluntarism? Like, how did that become a very necessary step? Like, I'm not just hearing you say we need to end corruption. I'm hearing you say we need absolute freedom, and not everybody has that as part of their process. So take us through that a bit.
Okay, so end of 2019, I gave notice to my firm that I would leave my job, didn't know what I would do next. And in early 2020, I very quickly wrote a second book called An End to Upside Down Living, which is still related to the nature of reality, spirituality, and it's focused on how one would live life and a bit of my personal journey. So I finished that really quickly in 2020, and then the lockdowns hit, and I had left my firm. So I was in this very free space to just explore things because I didn't have a job, and this new book was done. And I was watching COVID very closely. And it started with the censorship. And I just realized quickly there was a narrative being pushed. And if you questioned it, you weren't allowed to do that. You were going to be censored or shadow banned or whatever. And I had seen that in other places before, professionally and in my research on consciousness. So it made me want to understand what was going on. Is there something more systemic? And I spent maybe the next year looking at all that and trying to understand the duality of good, evil, within what I regard to be something that's overall benevolent. I think that's at the highest level, the universe is benevolent. That's just my current hypothesis. And yet there is this incredible evil. And I was trying to understand that and reconcile it because I had done a little bit of that in my second book, but I realized there was a lot that I didn't understand. So those were the ideas I was grappling with. And then in the backdrop, there was a lot of political unrest in the world that I was seeing, and people were siding with medical issues based on their political affiliations, which I thought was interesting. And you were alluding to this, Emily. I had no political orientation, at least explicitly, before that. Like, if you had asked me before 2020, are you a Democrat or Republican, I wouldn't have even understood where to start, which might sound hard to believe, but I was laser focused on my job and just before that, tennis and school and friends and all that sort of thing. I didn't care about politics at all. And even when I started to research consciousness, I was worried about the otherworldly stuff, not as much this world. I wanted to understand the nature of reality. And then as I saw that there was deeply evil stuff happening in this world. I wanted to understand the political structures and how are people thinking about politics. And then I kind of, maybe it's a natural process when you look into that, then you start to hear about libertarian ideas because they're not left or right per se. And then ideas about anarchy, which means no rulers. That starts to come into play. So I heard some of those ideas, and I think it really, I latched on to this notion of voluntaryism when I came across the work of Larken Rose, The Most Dangerous Superstition. That book was a big one for me, so I quote him a bunch in my book. And then also the work of Murray Rothbard and the Austrian School of Economics. I just latched on as soon as I started reading their stuff. I'm like, this is really big. And I had not thought about politics in this way before. So that's the origin story. And then when I went down the rabbit hole, I realized this is the most logically consistent system in terms of how we should organize ourselves. And it aligns with a lot of my inferences about the nature of reality and spirituality.
So it's probably weird to think that like you were a person who obviously worked in finance, so economics, and that you had never, I'm guessing you'd never had any awareness that there was an Austrian school of economics, right? Right. No. You know, that it isn't even discussed, you know, should raise eyebrows for people. Even if you discuss it and then discard it, the fact that it's not discussed is more suspicious than if it were discussed and discarded, right? Like in your school or in you know, in the industry in general. Larken Rose was the biggie for me as well. I came across him really early on in like the political awakening, right? I come from a family that is definitely much more leftist. And in my voting life, I only ever voted for Democrats. I wasn't I wasn't like a diehard voter. I didn't always vote and didn't vote in all the things. But if I did, I'd always voted for Democrats. And the last time that I voted was for Barack Obama in 2008. And I had already begun a lot of my waking up processes. And I was still in that space of easily confused into thinking that he might be part of the solution to the things I saw as problems. But then I had this really weird experience of like, I voted, he won the election, and then between the election and inauguration, I went to South Africa with my family. And both my sister and my father have essentially PhDs in African history focused on issues around South Africa. So like apartheid and corruption and all of this kind of stuff. So we went to Africa, and the way people, particularly in areas of South Africa, Swaziland, and Mozambique, when they saw us, they would like point at us and almost like go into some sort of weird, like, you know, when people see Michael Jackson in concert and you see the videos of them fainting, they would point at us and say, Obama, Obama. Like it was weird, like that they really felt like some major improvement in the world was about to happen because us Westerners had voted for Obama and whatnot, right? So I have that experience. And then my sister was living in DC at the time. After Africa, before I went back home to Los Angeles, because that's where I was living at the time, I stayed with her for a little bit in Washington, DC. And it happened that the inauguration was happening while we were there. Well, I was there. So we went to the inauguration. And I would say, so this day, with the possible exception of like certain things I've experienced at raves, because I was very much like dance music. And I have been to some of those raves that people talk about where it's just like the whole room is moving in sync and, you know, whatever. The amount of energy and hope and like vibrant everything that was in the crowd that day was palpable. It was incredible, right? And then I think within 2 or 3 weeks of him being sworn in, I had realized that I had been lied to. I had been tricked. He was not anything like what people thought or hoped or whatever, and that I was never going to be tricked again. And I started researching this, you know, really hard in terms of like politics and corruption in a different way than I'd been looking at things before. And I'd say, like, Republicanism or conservatism never seemed like the solution to whatever that was to me, but I did find my way and like kind of paused on Ron Paul for a little bit and sort of libertarianism. But there was something about that, at least for me and my perception then, that it felt like a lot of the people that liked libertarianism or Ron Paul, like it felt as a person coming from the left at that point, that they were mostly concerned about money and things related to economics and finances and markets and things like that, which at that point I didn't know a lot about and resonated for me in a way that wasn't it. But when I found Larken Rose and he took me through the relationship with authority and how it's religious in nature. And at that, at that point, I was still an atheist. And so easily able to go, or actually, no, I think I maybe was already, kind of shifting from there by then, but that made more sense to me. And I feel like he speaks about it from a much more logical and human sort of freedom kind of space. He talks about markets, but he's not the biggest proponent in the world of like the free market will solve everything. It's more about just like the philosophy of, human liberty and freedom and, why authority is always, a setup for the kind of thing that we're living in now. And that was hugely meaningful to me. Like, I remember the first time I ever heard him, and then I went and listened to like everything I could find from him. And my girlfriend recently just read the book, and she's, a recovering Republican, right? And so it's been interesting to watch her so many years like later go through that sort of movement with him. And like that was it for me. Like, I was outside of the political sphere within just a few months of having had the Obama experience because of having found the Larken Rose, sort of work. What do you the difference between, how do you see the difference between libertarianism and voluntaryism? Because the ways that libertarianism didn't sort of resonate completely for me, voluntaryism very much does. And I feel like it's a better proposal to other people who have questions about the ideas we like to talk about than libertarianism. Can you sort of get into sort of what that is for you?
Sure. Well, there's a question here of terminology first. Some people would consider voluntarism to be libertarianism, depending on who you're talking to. So when I think about libertarianism, generally, it is the idea that power is dangerous, so it wants to limit government. The extreme version of that is voluntarism or anarchism, in my view, or what some would call anarcho-capitalism. They're all essentially the same thing, depending on who you ask. So voluntarism, that extreme version, posits no government at all, or no compulsory government. You could have services that the government currently provides, but it would be engaged on a voluntary basis, where you'd say, look, I'm going to hire you to do X, Y, and Z. Libertarians might agree with a lot of stuff in voluntarism, but they might say, well, we still need the government to do these things on a compulsory basis, meaning you don't have control. It's not a fully voluntary relationship. They believe more in limited government, whereas a voluntarist would say no government at all. And that's the key distinction.
Yeah, no, I mean, that part, do you see what I'm talking about as far as a lot of people who are proponents of libertarianism? It is more like minarchism or minimal government, but there's this reliance on, and one of the things I struggle with when people talk about anarcho-capitalism as well, like, I understand the ideas and they're fine for me, but as a person who's interested in getting more people to be interested in this, when you hear a term, when you hear the amount of time that is spent talking about how there's a market solution for everything, or when you call something anarcho-capitalism, it sounds really different than all interactions should be voluntary, right? Yeah. I love to use the term voluntarist because most people don't know what that is. Most people think they know what an anarchist is, and they think that that's people running around in the streets wearing black and throwing Molotov cocktails and, absolute chaos and whatnot. And so then I have the opportunity to explain to them what voluntarism is. And everyone who's never heard of it always has a better reaction to that than to anarchism, even though you and I understand that it's the same thing. I guess one of the concerns, like I've spent a lot of time, because she asks a lot of really good questions when we go through Larken's book or your book, right? And I've come to the space of understanding that, like, there's a lot of people who naturally tend towards the right, even if they've come to intellectually understand the concepts of freedom or voluntarism or whatnot. They tend naturally towards conservative or right-leaning ideas. And they seem to display a comfort with being, when I say governed, it could be by government, or it could just be by ideas that are entrepreneurial or economic in nature, right? And then people who tend more to the left, even if they seem to have understanding of the ideas of liberty and voluntarism, they tend to be more comfortable with being governed, even if just by ideas of activism or emotion or something like that. And the people on the other side don't want to live under that. And whether that comes from an overarching government or just those ideas, like I sometimes wonder, and I think you may be a person with the sort of broad intellect, but also like the different things you've looked into maybe uniquely qualify you for sort of bridging this gap. How do we overcome that as we try to like get out of the circles of just those of us who already believe this, intellectualizing about it, to something that more and more people are interested in, may come to believe is a good thing and want to participate in, and move this forward? Because it feels like it's been in an intellectual space for a really long time, but not very far into like an actual space.
Yeah. You made a lot of really good points that I've been thinking about too. Well, with regard to the economic part of anarchism, I find it valuable because it can appeal to the intellectual people who say, well, that will never work. So the theoretical economics and the anarcho-capitalism is almost just a justification to help people understand why it would work. But I totally agree with you that I like the term voluntaryism as well, because it gets to the core of the issue, which is that why should we have authority if you didn't consent to it? Why do we need to have that? And it feels to me like, generally speaking, the left and the right politically today, they have a view on the world and they want to control other people and force them under their worldview. And that's something that I really oppose on both sides. I might agree with certain people on both sides of the aisle, but this notion that, well, because I think this is true, I have a right to force you to live a certain way, that to me is highly problematic from a spiritual lens as well. So I focus a lot on the non-aggression principle, which I talk about in the book, and it's a highly libertarian idea, which is that basically don't hurt people and don't mess with their stuff. More formally, it's that no one has a right to initiate aggression against a person's body or the property that they own, which is aggression could be physical violence, fraud, coercion, theft, any of those things. That's aggression. But if someone initiates aggression against you or your property, you have a right to self-defense. So what I've tried to do in my approach to, getting the ideas out there more is like that simple idea, because a lot of people intuitively agree with that. They probably would agree with that idea. And then when it comes to, well, we're going to force you to pay taxes to fund this thing that you might find immoral, they don't necessarily make that leap it's a violation of the non-aggression principle, because they'd say, well, no, these people, that we need to have this common good, and therefore we have to take your money. But wait a second, you just violated the principle. So what I'm trying to do is for myself, first and foremost, and then try to explain it to people, is we need to have these principles to start. And once we all have those principles, or a majority of us or a critical mass of us has that non-aggression principle in mind, that we need to engage on a voluntary basis, and you have a right to self-defense if there's a violation of that, then solutions will emerge. I don't know what the solution is. And in a voluntarist world, the solutions will be varied because people have different preferences. So you might have a more left-leaning way of living life, and that's totally fine as long as you're not messing with other people. So you might be in a community on a voluntary basis where you're going to live under that way, and other people might have a different way of living. So the way that I put it in the book is that this is in very general terms, is that there is a building of the new, so however that manifests, of people building a new world, basically. But then there's also a breaking down of the current structure, of the old structure from the inside. And I don't know how that's going to work, because politics is so complicated in terms of like how governments are set up. But theoretically, if you had people with really high integrity on the inside, and if you got some powerful people to shrink the government from the inside, that would be a beneficial thing too.
So it's interesting because what you've been thinking about a lot lately is exactly where these questions that we've been asking has really led me. The main issue, the main problem, because everybody can, when you break it down, especially if you use words they haven't heard of before, and you can give them a definition that isn't swayed by some idea they had about it before or whatever, people will say, okay, what you're saying actually sounds reasonable. How would we go about it? But it sounds reasonable. And then when we start to think about how one would go about it, I came across the same thing. Everybody would literally have to let go of the idea that they know better about what's good, a good way for someone to live than someone else does, right? Like, this is the nature, like, we all do this. Once we figure out something out, we want to enforce our newfound awareness, even if it's 100% right, on somebody who isn't there yet, or somebody who their newfound awareness tells them something different. And even these like small ways of doing it, it's one thing in your job, your boss or whatever, but we're doing it all the time, right? And this was never more like clearly on display than during the lockdowns and during COVID, when people with like zero scientific knowledge or medical knowledge or any health awareness ever, like heard a person say a thing and thought they understood it, and then was telling everybody else to do the thing. And if you didn't do the thing, then, you were bad. And I saw people who like had never thought a second about like their health in their entire life, like suddenly become obsessed with everyone's health on March 11th, 2020, and move from that space. Right. So this need to enforce what you think is fair or right or good on somebody else, no matter how small or large it is like, it's something almost all of us have to overcome, because I catch myself doing it. And I believe in the things that we're talking about here, right? One of the obvious ones, and it's a hard one to overcome because it ties into so many emotional things, is people who wanted health freedom around the COVID situation, and then people who want bodily or health freedom around the abortion situation, like they want it on their terms, and they want to enforce what they think that means on the other group of people, where if people could get over the idea that they know best for someone else, that could have been like a natural alliance of people to actually push health freedom, or bodily autonomy forward. I agree with you that when people understand these principles, solutions will start to pop up, and the solutions will be different in many. But what I'm talking about here, like, do you see, how do we start to move that conversation forward when like it's like, so people get emotional so fast, they get angry so fast, and they can't see it. They can't just move their head, like they can't turn to see the room from another angle for even just a little bit on some of these issues.
Yeah. Well, in my newest book, Into the Upside Down Reset, I spent a lot of time on human psychology, because I'm trying to understand this too. How could people have a principle in one place and then abandon that principle in another situation and not realize that they're abandoning the principle? And I'm often perplexed by the desire to be compassionate and caring in some situations, and then ignoring that in other situations, and like, what's going on there? My approach, just because it's my nature, is to try to figure out intellectually and then share it. And one of the reasons I think now, deconstructing my own psychology, I like writing books and having conversations like this, is that I can get ideas out there without violating the non-aggression principle. I'm just putting stuff out there, but I'm not forcing it on anyone. I'm not forcing someone to read the book. They can if they want. It's a paradigm shift, ultimately, is what's going to need to happen. I don't see any other way around it, where people are going to have to open their minds, everyone, to acknowledge, to try to think about all sides of an equation, all sides of an issue, and not just their own bias. A big part of this, though, is what we see in the media and the education system, where there is a certain narrative that's pushed, and a brainwashing and really mind control that hypnotizes people into almost a zombie-like state, which completely blows my mind, because it can happen to the most intellectual people, where then they get stuck in a loop still, where they are completely closed off to something that violates the selected narrative. So I don't know the way around it. It's probably going to be multifaceted. I think podcasts are really valuable. Books are valuable. but also a shift within the media and the education system. And the onus might be on people to say, okay, the narrative is this, but I'm going to, on my own, for the sake of myself and my family, I'm going to hear out alternative opinions.
Yeah, I mean, that's so. First of all, I am just imposing the questions on you that have come up in our discussions, right? Because these are the same brick walls that I've sort of come upon, right? And I think this is like our ability to come up with maneuvers or techniques or whatever this is to start to move through that wall, right? Maybe some people are going over it, around it, others moving through it. Is important, and to challenge each other is how we do it. I listen to things that I completely agree with, things I like totally with every cell in my being disagree with, lots of things in between. And I even sometimes listen to things that like I know or are nonsense, because sometimes there's like a special kind of syntax to nonsense that for some reason like people believe that more than something that is like definitely true. And if you can sort of learn what it is about the delivery of that kind of information that makes it digestible for people, then there's some value in there. So I listen to all kinds of shit. Like sometimes Laura will be like, what are you listening to? Why are you listening to that? Like there's this, I listen to this totally communist, and by the way, I don't in any way really associate with necessarily left-leaning ideals anymore. It's just what I came from. And I guess I like, the sort of stereotypical things that they say people from the left like: open-mindedness, good food, good culture, art, whatever. Mm-hmm. I think that's a human like, but I love listening to this channel, right? It's called like the Revolutionary Blackout, right? And I disagree with most of what they say, but like there's a few things that they say with such a directness, right? Like there's like a few like ideas in there that are like exactly right. And so that I'm in complete agreement with. And so the fact that like there's all this other stuff that I mostly see as like either, I don't want to be judgmental, wrong or nonsensical, or I don't see how they can't see that would lead back to the thing they say they don't like. The fact that they so succinctly say this thing that is very obviously true, like, okay, this gives a path for connection with some of these people to share ideas or to talk to other people I know who feel that way. So I listen to all kinds of stuff, and she'll be like, what on earth are you listening to? But there was something I wanted to ask you about. There was something that you said. Oh, I know. Are you at all concerned? Like one of the things, I have a show that I do with my friend Danny, who is a childhood friend who comes from similar background, was also a high-level athlete, and she's very focused on language and propaganda. Mm-hmm. She was a journalist. She used to write for the LA Weekly and, a bunch of other kinds of things. But we're very focused on like what is going on, particularly with movements and with these people that are being presented to us as the solution to the overarching corrupt system that are like really not that much different. They say a couple of things that we like, but their belief system or the way that they would structure reality is maybe only 1 or 2 degrees different from the overlords we have right now. And that these movements like liberty movement, health freedom movement, anti this or that movement, that they're always in danger of being co-opted by someone who agrees with whatever our main complaint is right now, and maybe 1 or 2 other things, but still maintains the belief, not just in like authority in this sort of government way, but one of the things I'm really, really concerned with, and your interest in science and where you come from sort of would make you a good person to look at this deferment of our thinking and our ability to make decisions about ourselves to an expert class, even if they have theoretically nothing to do with government, right? And all these movements are always looking for new people to become the expert on that topic or the leader of that movement. And undoubtedly, they always have some of the same faults and shortcomings as the person that we just got rid of or that they're there to help us get rid of. What do you think about that? And how do we not continue to fall into those sort of traps and pitfalls as we try to advance these ideas?
To me, it comes down to the idea of personal responsibility. which is a big part of voluntaryism, but it's a philosophical paradigm shift, because when a person has a sense of personal responsibility, then I think there's a natural tendency to question the authorities and the expert class always. And maybe there are times when you might just not know as much about a certain topic, so you want to get the opinion from someone, but maybe it's not just that one person you hear from a wide range, because ultimately it's my responsibility, whatever decision I make. So I'm not just going to bank everything on one person. So maybe I don't know if it's a human tendency or if it's just part of our conditioning in this society, where if someone has certain degrees and they're of a certain level of credibility, then all of a sudden you're supposed to listen to everything that person says. I'm completely against that. And that's when I talk about the Great Reset. The term that I use is elitism, this idea that certain people know what's best for others. And that seems to be a big part of all these movements, whether it's a Great Reset or other ones. And a lot of people go along with it. So it's a shift in consciousness. That's like my answer to everything, because on a metaphysical level and a personal level and a physical world level, because that's what it is. It's a different way of thinking about life ultimately. And to me, it stems from personal responsibility.
What do you think would have to happen, or what would be the catalyst that would, I mean, I know what it was for me in my personal life, you know what it is for you, and a lot of people that we've met in this process have somewhat similar sort of awakening or origin stories. What do you think it would take for this to be a big enough shift, and kind of not one that takes forever to happen? Or like, because there's something that you could imagine that could be done, that would happen, that would be like that moment of like, okay, here's our chance, let's go? Or do you think it's just going to continue to be this sort of inch by inch, one by one, and because life isn't meaningless and we have many more of them, even what comes after death and whatnot, that eventually over the long arc of time, we will get to this place?
When I wrote my second book, An End to Upside Down Living, I spent a lot of time studying awakening journeys. And there are lots of parallels, even though the specifics of a person's life might be different. And there's a phenomenon known as the dark night of the soul, where life gets so bad that you have no choice but to adapt or not, and maybe you die or something. So a person, in some cases, they might have a near-death experience where they're in cardiac arrest, and then they develop an awareness that they didn't have before because they were literally in other dimensions. In other cases, their life circumstances they might get sick, they might have a breakup, they might get fired from their job. Things in their life don't go a certain way, and then they get pushed in a new direction. And that's certainly what happened to me, just in my own way, my own life circumstances. So maybe that is needed for certain people. And I've heard people theorize that COVID was a version of a dark night of the soul, where people were just like, many people had paradigm shifts because they got forced to, because life circumstances forced them to. But there are a lot of people that maybe didn't wake up from that. So the dark night of the soul is one solution. Maybe that's a cosmic solution that is imposed on us by whatever intelligence the universe is made of, where it's like, okay, it's time for you to wake up. And if you don't, maybe it's going to be your next life, or I don't know how it works exactly. And I also, at the same time, wonder if there's certain people that literally will never wake up, no matter what evidence is presented to them. And maybe it's not their time, because I'm just so flabbergasted, especially among people who are intellectual, that I know who will not wake up. They will find a reason to counter everything. And they're just not going to shift paradigms. Some people say, and I have one friend who told me this when I wrote my first book, he was like, Mark, you're probably right about this, but my life is good as is, and I don't want to rock the boat. So I'm not going to even go down this road, where people feel like it's just not for them to explore alternative ways of looking at life. And that makes me wonder, maybe we need to have parallel societies, or that's how it's going to develop, where there are certain people that do it one way in the old paradigm, and then other people who are open to the new paradigm.
Yeah, no, I like that answer. I have a cousin who said a similar thing to me, that, Emily, hers wasn't, but actually, I know you're right, but like what it would mean for me to like think about that stuff and feel that all the time. And, you have to sort of sit with a certain level of like knowing some yucky stuff to sort of move through this. She's like, I wouldn't be able to live that way, which in some ways felt more respectful than the people who just tell me like I'm a crazy conspiracy theorist or an alt-right Nazi or whatever it is, right? Like she she obviously had looked into it enough that she understood that this is likely what was going on. And she was just like, I can't, which I have more respect for than the people who won't even look at all. But I think one of the things, and it's interesting because you prior had thought life was meaningless. And then over the course of this, you've come to understand that it's absolutely not. I think the reason a lot of people will not look, will not change is because they're afraid that if they find out that they were wrong about everything or that they had been lied to and what they thought was reality really wasn't, then it would mean that their life was meaningless. Right? That like all of the experiences they had didn't matter because they were under mind control or they were being snowed, they wouldn't trust anything. And to me, it feels like the exact opposite. All of those experiences brought you to right now, the moment where you're having the realization that things are not what they seem and you have the choice to wake up. And I can't think of anything like more meaningful than that. But I think that fear, like the same thing, like it's almost like the opposite of what you had thought about life being meaningless. I think that's a thing for a lot of people. But the parallel societies that you mentioned, I think that is maybe the most likely way forward for us. And I was having this conversation with a friend over dinner the last time that I was in Los Angeles, and like what that would look like if we started to develop sort of parallel societies, right? Like opt-in, opt-out kind of society, or like personal responsibility, outsourcing responsibility kind of societies, right? I mean, you can name it a bunch of different things, but like that's basically what it comes down to, right? Is sort of that. And that, we could coexist in the same space that way, but some people don't participate in collective programs. And if they want to go into a space that is run by collective programs or whatever, then that is, there's protocols for working at that. I think parallel societies might be like the way forward. And maybe enough people will go, well, that one over there looks better. And more people become interested, or maybe not. And we just are like people driving in two different lanes on the same highway, right? Or maybe even, there's the tollway that you pay and then the free one over here, but they're going the same, you can still go all the places and you're not bothered by the people on the other one as much, I don't know. It seems to me that it's going to have to be, at least for a time being, something like that before there's a more massive shift into, I see that this way is really superior. This is a better way for more people to live with more freedom. And maybe some people don't think that.
Right now, it feels like parallel societies is the only way forward to some degree, because people are living in different realities. That's what I find. How can you live under the same roof if you look at something and say that's a really good thing and another person says that's totally evil? It's irreconcilable very often. And it's hard to imagine a peaceful kind of society when you have that level of polarization. So unless there's something to unify people, which again, to me, that requires a paradigm shift. And like we've been talking about, I don't know if everyone is willing to do that. So in the interim, maybe we have to do it that way, where there's people are in parallel, and maybe we already have that to an extent. I mean, I see it forming, and people are collecting in different groups based on their worldview effectively, and new groups seem to be forming and people are gravitating towards each other.
Yeah, I mean, you hear, and maybe it's a different way than you or I would think about it, but you hear these conversations going on about ideas of like national divorce or things like that, right? And that isn't necessarily how I would think about it, but that is the beginnings of conversations about sort of parallel societies in some ways. So yeah, no, I agree. One last question before we wrap up the first hour and move over into the supporters hour, and is you have seemingly has this been difficult for you? Like, what does your family think? What do your friends think? You seem to have been able to make this transition and talk about it and actually gain some degree of attention and respect from corners that a lot of us are just called crazy conspiracy theorists by. Like, you've had a lot of attention on your podcast and some attention on your books, and you seem to have been able to make this shift somewhat smoothly. Like, I know lots of people whose lives were destroyed by waking up. Yours seems to have been enriched, which that's great. Like I've read, that's wonderful. I think it's the timing is part of it. There's something unique about your sort of overall understanding and the way you present yourself. But personally, what has it been like for you? Have you lost friends? Did your family challenge you on this? Were there serious repercussions for you as well that ever made you go, oh, I don't know about this?
Really good question. I want to give an extended answer, but before I forget, there's a book about secession that opened my eyes to just new ways of thinking. It's called Breaking Away by Ryan McMaken, who's an Austrian economist. So I recommend that to your listeners if you're just interested in thinking about that topic.
Awesome.
In terms of my journey, okay, let's start with my first book, because I had hesitations with publishing that book. I was still working. I was working my way up at the firm. I was not a partner yet. This was 2016, 2017. My worldview totally shifted, and I was thinking about the reality of psychic abilities, reincarnation, surviving after the body dies, crazy stuff. And at first, when I had the inclination that maybe I should write a book, which happened in the summer of 2017, I thought to myself, I can't write about this stuff. Even though it's well backed by science, I can't do that because I'm in traditional business world. And then very quickly, I thought, this is so important. I need to do it. And it's going to be backed by data. So I'm going to have 500s of citations, then at least I can do this and feel comfortable with it. So I was worried and then not that worried. And while I was still working, I was just in the first book podcast zone. So it was science of consciousness. And I was totally comfortable with that, even if some people thought I was crazy. And there were some people who told me not to go forward with any of that. The majority of people, friends and family, were supportive, but there were a few who were like, no, no, that you're crazy for doing this. Please don't do it. For your own sake. I'm your friend. Don't do it. I had a little bit of that. And I was just, that to me was frustrating because I'm like, hey, have you looked at any of the research yourself? And most of them hadn't really thought about it, or they'd say, well, if that were true, if there were such good statistical evidence, then these people that I respect, they would be accepting these ideas.
I hate that answer. I've gotten it so many times too. Yes.
Even it doesn't matter how many peer-reviewed papers I show, it doesn't click. So I accepted that. And I said, okay, that's fine. Then we got into the more conspiratorial stuff, challenging government, challenging politics, talking about the nature of evil. I mean, in my book called An End to Upside Down Contact, I talk about non-physical entities that are benevolent and some that are evil, purely evil. And I talk about ritual abuse, really dark stuff. And so there's been hesitation internally about, do I want to talk about these things that are risky to talk about? And I would say also this new book about the Great Reset, and I talk about the ideology that underlies a lot of it, which is leftism. And I look at that not just from a political sense, but from a sociocultural sense and a metaphysical sense. Even mentioning that word, a lot of people are going to be upset. So my journey has been one where, I mean, this is very much ongoing and developing. I'm interested in trying to uncover what the truth is about our reality. Like we've been deceived, or we live in a state of ignorance. To me, that's clear. And I want to get past that. And in doing that, I'm realizing I'm going to upset people. So I've had to become comfortable with the fact that I'm going to upset people. I might lose friends. I mean, this new book just came out, so I don't know what's going to happen with it. I think the Liberty book, because I definitely upset some people with it, but I feel like I was able to toe the middle ground a little bit more. The Great Reset stuff, I think, is going to be more controversial. And I know I will lose some people. And I just have to be okay with that.
I mean, it sounds like you're at the point where it's like they're going to have to go at some point. So this is the time for them to go, right? I mean, it's freeing in some ways, right? Like yeah. I actually saw as painful as it was, some of the things I learned about people during the lockdowns. Thank God I know it now, because otherwise I could have gone my whole life, or at least many more years, thinking this person had a level of sort of respect or tolerance for me or other people that they didn't really have. And anything could have triggered at any moment this absolute sort of rejection of, and it was a great learning experience. And we did all have that sort of collectively. I don't think there's anybody on the world who didn't lose a friend or something like that, during that time, regardless of what your position on it was, right? So for me, it was like, though it was painful, I appreciate the experience of people showing me who they are, right? I love having friends that I disagree with. Just because you disagree, like, doesn't mean you can't be friends. Like, I have friends that think that like everything I say is like Looney Tunes, but they're amused by it and they're willing to accept it because they remember they've always loved me. We've been friends for a long time, and okay, that's fine. If something is so strong that they need to push me away, then I'm glad to sort of know that about them.
Yeah, you're describing something I've been thinking about a lot, which is the way I think about it is that I'm getting data. When I put this stuff out there that's controversial, I'm learning a lot about the people around me and the world around me in terms of who gravitates towards it, who's going to at least look at it with an open mind, who will not look at it at all without even understanding what I'm talking about. They'll just say no because they heard a certain word they don't like. I learn a lot from that. And my hypothesis is that by reducing my filter effectively, by putting out there what I think is true, or at least what seems reasonable, I'm going to attract into my life other people that are thinking in a similar way. And that could be a very positive thing, in addition to hopefully influencing people who pick up the book, and maybe they'll shift. But in my own life, maybe it's going to help find more like-mindedness.
All right, we're going to move over into the supporters segment. You can join us at patreon.com/offplanetmedia, emilymoyer.locals.com, or rockfin.com/Emily Moyer. We're going to move over there. I want to talk a little bit about athletics and how that how that correlates to maybe a whole part of the holistic awakening kind of thing. And I also want to talk a little bit about your new book, because you brought that up a couple of times. And I think that we can explore some of that without me obviously having read it yet, because it just came out. But before we do, let people know where they can find you, where they can get your book, all that jazz.
Sure. My website is the best place to find out about me. It's called markgober.com, markgober.com. My books, there are 5 of them currently. They're all on Amazon, and they are in Kindle, hard copies, and Audible. And my podcast is called Where Is My Mind? And that's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all the major players.
And that's not an ongoing podcast, correct? It was just like a series that you did at the sort of early on in your work. Okay, cool. That's what I thought.
It's in 8 episodes. Yeah, 8 episodes. You can binge them. It's a conversation between me and my producer, and we take clips of the people that I interviewed. So it's spliced into a narrative.
Awesome. Okay, guys, we're going to move over to the other side. We'll see you over there.